Contracting is, in my opinion, by committee. It's never an edict where one person always says, this is how it is. It's always a team. I call it a team sport, right? On the government side, it really is, because the contracting officer does not have all the answers. They rely on technical experts. They rely on legal counsel to help them make the best business decisions they can for the government's interest, and also be fair to the contractor when they're making those decisions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to have Ms. Shauna Weatherly with us today from Federal Subcontract Solutions. And so she is joining us, and we're going to have her introduce herself to our audience. It's going to be an amazing conversation, talking about some compliance things today. So Shauna, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Shauna Weatherly, and I'm the president and founder of Federal Subcontract Solutions, or Fed Sub K for short. I started my business about 5 years ago while I was still a federal employee. Got the blessing of my agency at the time to do that, because I no longer held a contracting officer's warrant, and I wanted something extra to do, right, in my spare time. So I started working with small businesses when I was a federal contracting officer. I was a federal employee for about 35, almost 36 years, and in acquisition most of that time, and worked with small businesses a lot, and really enjoyed working, explaining the federal contracting process and how they fit into that process best. And I saw there was a need. So when I got out, I decided that I wanted to focus on helping small businesses dissect and understand and expand maybe their federal contracting knowledge, so that they had a better opportunity, fairer chance, better understanding of the process that they were playing in the federal market space. And I've been doing that now for a little over a year, after I retired in December. So that's kind of what I've been doing in a nutshell for the last 12 months.
Well, I know, Shauna, we met when you, probably not too long after you started your business. We actually met, and we have hit it off from the beginning. And I'm so excited that because Shauna and myself get to have great conversations in the background, and we finally get to introduce you to our audience. And Shauna's depth of knowledge it just surpasses probably a lot of ours, right? And so with her 35 years plus in the federal space, and I was glancing over your bio officially, and over $750 billion in contracts that you have, had responsibility for, we believe that you've got some great things to share with our audience today. And we're so
good.
Excited. So I know you're doing, like you said, your own business. And I'm going to start there with just some of the things that you have seen. And then we're going to go into some of these other compliance things, focus on construction, and whether it's small business, middle market, and large businesses. What are some of the things that you are seeing that they're experiencing?
Well, I think one of the first thing I'm seeing is small businesses are anxious to get their first contract awards, right? Everybody is looking for that first award out of the gate. But I think sometimes small businesses, and even large businesses too, are not always thinking about the compliance piece of a contract before they get to performance. And it's very, very important that in my opinion, that businesses start to recognize and think about that compliance piece before they get their first contract, and not after. I've had a couple of clients come to me after the fact and say, wow, we didn't realize we had to be compliant with all these things. And just looking at what you have to sign up to when you're registering your firm in Sam.Gov, and all those representations and certifications that you have to fill out, know that just about every one of those becomes some sort of clause after the fact in your contract, and more at the FAR, Federal Acquisition Regulation level, FAR, or then even at your agency level, depending on the agency that is awarding your contracts. So, don't play catch up. Get in there, understand the compliance pieces early, and make sure you have a compliance structure and strategy to make sure you meet those, because you don't want to fail on those, especially on your first contract, for sure.
Absolutely. And, kind of backing up a little bit, Why did you even go in the direction of, KO, really diving in and understanding the FAR? Because now you're able to, you're out and you're helping people. So you bring all those stories and knowledge with you. I'm sure you've got some amazing industry stories,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
of your 35 years that maybe you could share some with us, with, of course, leaving all names out of it.
Of course.
So, but even like, how did you end up down that path? And how did you end up with such deep knowledge of the FAR like you do have?
Well, I think it started out as I started out as a secretary really in the government and in HR and was doing that. And I was a military spouse and I had this chance to get a promotion into a procurement technician position. And I had no idea what federal procurement was all about. I had no idea. I just knew people were negotiating contracts and they were over there dealing with performance and payment bonds and things like this. And I thought, what the heck, I'll help them out, right? And this was back in the day when we used to manually mail out solicitation documents and things like that. I mean, I'm aging myself here, but yeah, mailing out these bids and specs packages. It were hundreds of pages and rolls of plans, and it was crazy. But I worked with contracting officers that really allowed me to kind of dive into a little bit more than my duties required. And I got to sit in some contract negotiations. I got to, participate in construction bid openings. I got to, play around with understanding performance and payment bonds and all of that. And I thought, this is something maybe I can do. It seems pretty creative. They're trying to keep work going while they're still trying to follow the rules. And I just started diving into that arena. In terms of having the FAR knowledge, it's very much part of the training that a contracting officer goes through, right? I mean, back in the day when I went through the first class was a 4-week class on the federal acquisition regulation. And you went there in person for 4 weeks and just talked about all the parts of the FAR. So you start from that basis of knowledge and then you just add to it as you go. And then every experience and every contract you work on also adds to that basis of knowledge, right? So over time, it's not hard to have a wide understanding of it. And particularly if you move around, and I've worked at several different agencies, civilian and military, and even a non-FAR agency at FAA. So that's part of how I got into it. I found it to be a creative process and a problem solving, critical thinking type process. And I really enjoyed that.
Well, Shauna, I think you're the first person I've heard creative and federal go together.
I know a lot of people don't believe it, but you really have to problem solve, and it takes some creativity to find the gray area in federal regulations and procurement to allow you to kind of work through some of the things you have to. So there's where the creativity comes into play.
Okay, that is interesting. Everything's normally black and white. Like, okay,
yeah.
There's no gray in between when it comes to the federal government, as far as you're concerned about, all the reps and certs and everything that you're in compliance with, right?
Right.
So that's interesting that you used that word. I was like, creative, got it. Okay. And you didn't share, for example, like the different agencies, your breadth of knowledge across the federal with so many different agencies. Why don't you share that too?
Yeah. Well, I started out, working in a procurement or in a personnel shop and learned a little bit about that. I was a military spouse, so I have a military background there too, just since I was 18 years old, been around the military. But I was got my first acquisition job with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and that was a wide eye experience. The Army Corps of Engineers does a lot of work. It's not all construction. There's a lot of services and a lot of supplies that are bought, operations and maintenance, anything you can think of, they're doing. And I feel really fortunate that was my first major long-term agency I worked at, because I got a chance to do a lot of things that you don't always get to do in other agencies. And then I was recruited over into FAA to help them work at their logistics center, get that going here at Mike Monroney Aeronautical Center, get it kind of up to speed. They were putting in a new logistics management system. And at the same time, we were still having to acquire spares and parts and all sorts of things for radar systems that are in use all over the world that may go back as far as, the 50s and 60s. So, we're trying to keep some of those in play all over the world. And then I moved to GSA because I had an opportunity to actually teach contracting officers at that point and become more of a quality assurance person and a workforce development person and help develop future contracting officers. And there I also got a chance to work in project management. Actually, I went to the dark side, right? As we call it in contracting. And worked in project management and wrote the current set of contracts out there for the GSA Smart Pay contracts for the government's charge card services. And got a chance to be in FAR policy at the end and put all that information and everything I've learned and all the experiences into play to help inform policy and update Sam.Gov, which was actually the last office I worked at. So quite a bit of experience there.
Breadth of knowledge, right? That's why I call Shauna.
Yeah. a lot of places, a lot of different hats, and a lot of fun.
So going back to, now bringing all of those experiences and knowledge with you to your clients, are there any stories you ever share with them? Oh, let me tell you why you should not do that, because
no. Well, most of them, I try to tell them what they should do, right? And try, and there are those cautionary tales every once in a while, but one of the things I think small businesses are afraid of is to really even reach out and talk to people at the government. And I tell them all the time, don't be afraid to ask the questions. Don't be afraid to reach out. It is their job to, talk to you. They may be busy. They may sound standoffish. They will talk to you when they can. They will answer questions when they can, but understanding that there are points and times in the procurement process where they just simply can't because of the rules that are in play. But asking those questions is important because that's how you learn. You learn about the agency, you learn about mission, you learn about process. All those are things you're going to want to do, and you're building relationships at the same time. And that's very important. Even if the contracting officer has nothing that they can tell you, keep checking in with them, keep building that relationship, keep that going, because I will tell you that those are the people who are tenacious that, the contracting officers do remember, right? They remember. And when something comes up and they say, hey, that 8A company that's been calling me every 6 months for the last year or 2 years, this might be perfect for them. Have we thought of them? And that's how some companies get their first contracts. And actually, one of my clients is a former 8A firm that I gave them their first contract 20 some years ago. So, and now they're a client. So.
Oh, wow.
And that's how long those relationships can last.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it's awesome that they're still going. That they're still in business and successful.
Graduated and successful and making well over 10 million a year in federal work. So very, very good for them. Yeah.
Yeah, good for them. So so we can go on now. So great. That's great information. And I know that we talked about, again, the different size of companies. It doesn't matter. What are some of the things? I know you talked about contracts are not all the same, so don't assume, right? So is that better or worse for small, medium, large? Is it all the same? Should think about it that way linearly, or what's your thoughts about that?
Well, I think if you're trying to focus on one type of work, right? Let's say you're doing construction, you're going to be working with some of the same agencies most of the time, right? You're talking your DODs, your DHS, some of those. So you want to make sure that you understand not just the FAR rules, but their rules as well. That's really important. But if you go to jump to do construction work, let's say at an agency you're not used to doing it with, remember, like you said, not every contract is the same from agency to agency, even from contract to contract. It's not unusual for contracting officers to sometimes take different interpretations with contract clauses, or have different processes or different ways they want to see, let's say, reports come in or compliance reporting done, and saying, well, my last contracting officer did it this way is not going to help you. It's being prepared, being able to roll and be flexible and be agile in some of those ways is really important. And I think keeping that in mind, the change happens between just contract to contract and even agency to agency. It's not a cookie cutter game, as much as we'd like it to be, is very important to be prepared.
So now I know with the FAA, for example, with their AMS system, that it actually gave them or allows for their contracting team to have flexibility in the decisions they make. That's why they don't follow the FAR. But you shared something. You said not every KO may interpret it the same.
Right.
So I didn't realize that there could be room outside of FAA, right? But there's room for we said KO contracting officers to interpret the FAR slightly different.
Yeah, there are gray areas in the FAR. It is not always black and white. There are many places in the FAR where, let's say we're just talking about set-asides, where the FAR doesn't say that you must set aside certain actions. There are places where it says you may, the contracting officer may set aside or may decide or may determine. There's that gray area. Anytime you see may, that leaves it open for contracting officer interpretation. And contracting officers have traditionally been trained with business backgrounds. So, most contracting officers, at least those in my day and age, we had to have a minimum of 24 semester hours of business training, business degrees, if we didn't have that. And, we bring business knowledge to the decision-making process. So that's part of what a contracting officer has been trained to do, through their education and through experience and on-the-job training and formal training on the job too.
Okay, well, I mean, that's a great explanation to think, okay, so you don't have to do it this way. So does the contractor have a say in helping to influence what that may means?
Yeah, of course they do. They can do that. They can say, hey, in my opinion, this is what we see. These are the circumstances. That's why it's important. I've never had a contract where I didn't feel like the contractor and I couldn't discuss those types of things, right? Where it's very standoffish or arm length. It's important to build a rapport with the contracting officer and the contracting officer's representatives, right? That's who you want to, that's who you can influence. And they're going to tell you if it's a no-go. They're not going to do anything they can't do. They know the limits of their authority and what they should and shouldn't do. But when it's open to interpretation, it can be a discussion factor, right? And then you get other people involved. You get your finance people involved to see if you've got money. You get your legal involved to see if it can stand legally for the government. Is there too much risk or not enough, no risk? Those are you start bringing other people in. Contracting is, in my opinion, by committee. It's never an edict where one person always says, this is how it is. It's always a team. I call it a team sport, right? On the government side, it really is, because the contracting officer does not have all the answers. They rely on technical experts. They rely on legal counsel to help them make the best business decisions they can for the government's interest, and also be fair to the contractor when they're making those decisions.
That is so good, because we can feel intimidated sometimes by the contracting officer.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not uncommon. I mean, and they can be intimidating people. Yeah, I know. I've been that intimidating person.
It's like,
maybe I don't look like it, but I have been. Yeah.
It's like, leave me alone. No.
Yeah. Well, and some are very short and they're to the point, and you know where you stand, right? But there are times where it requires some discussion, and it's okay if they say something and you say, but have you thought of? But have you considered? I mean, I would never take that personally. I would just say, yes, I've considered it, and here's why it doesn't weigh in the decision, or it does, right? And how. But no CO should ever take it personally if somebody's questioning what they've done. There's always should be a rationale that can be supported, and every CO understands that, and KO and DOD, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that is great. So everybody, listen up. Now, don't go buck wild out there, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, be reasonable. Be reasonable.
Right. Don't attack them all at the same time.
Right. Yeah, it's not open season on COs and KOs, right?
Oh like, don't take them down. Just suggest.
Yeah. I mean, just be reasonable about it. It's don't demand, ask.
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 So do you recommend then that your contractors should study the FAR? Like, how do you help with that, right? To know loopholes or gray areas.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I mean, the FAR tells the government how to do procurement, but it's okay if you understand those rules too, right? And it's important that you do, because when there are these gray areas, sometimes contracting officers need a little bit of reminding. I mean, no offense, but COs sometimes get stuck in their ways. I've worked with people. I've probably been that person at a time or two in my career. And, I think it's not uncommon to say, hey, I understand FAR says what you're saying, but there's this area over here that says this. Does that weigh in? How does that play in? Explain it to me. Again, a contracting officer should be able to provide you reasonable rationale that you can easily see how they came up with their decision. Lord knows they have to document it. Right. Even if they, when they make a decision, they have to document it with rationale. So there should be no problem explaining it. And knowing the rules of the game is important to you to keep it fair for yourself.
Well, that is fair. And we, as contractors, definitely should educate ourselves. It's important for us to don't present ourselves ignorant. Like, if we're going to approach and ask, we better know why we can ask.
Yeah. Know why you can, and be familiar with it. If you're not sure what it means, then just ask the contractor, explain this part of the FAR to me, because to me it seems that this is what it says. Is that not what it means? They can provide an interpretation and how that plays into your contract, your performance, whatever the issue is. I've seen this happen recently with a contractor who had some equipment stolen on site, and the government oversaw the security at the site. And the contractor was like, okay, government, you oversaw the security on the site, but how does that play in for me in terms of getting reimbursed for this equipment? You told me where to stage my equipment. You told me you were going to secure the site. Now my equipment's been stolen. How does this play into my ability to get an equitable adjustment or get reimbursed for this equipment that's been stolen, so that I can continue proper performance for you? And, we just simply, I help that company, write a letter in the contracting officer's language, basically, back to them in a way to shape that, referencing FAR and saying, FAR gives us this. Is this your interpretation? Can we initiate an action? And they've been having successful conversations about it with the government to figure out their path, so they can be reimbursed.
Knowledge is key. There you go. Knowledge is key. So, and one of those areas that I want to, as you were talking, really popped into mind, because I was just having this conversation earlier today with my team about this, LPTA versus best value. One of those, construction. It's like, what I mean. Isn't LPTA supposed to go away, or like use it less? Let's focus more on best value, negotiated trade-offs, right? So can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, LPTA is supposed to be used more limited now. It's kind of a pendulum. I've seen it swing over my 35-year career, where there was a big push to use it a lot, and then we went all the way over to best value, and then there seemed to be a pendulum swing back to LPTA. But I'll just tell you, the government is not good at writing LPTA measures, right? Because low price technically acceptable means you need to set a measure of technical acceptance, and then whoever meets all those levels of technical acceptance, then whoever's the lowest price gets the award, right? But the government's not good at writing levels of technical acceptance in terms of setting a bar, right? Or a measure, or something that's very objective. That is either a yes or no, met or not met, right? The government's not very good at that. And they got themselves into situations with LPTA where it was really more best value. They were written in a way that it required subjective decision making. And that's not what LPTA is about. So that's why it's supposed to be used more sparingly, just because they're difficult to write. They're very difficult to write.
Well, is it only that, or does the, lowest bidder that wins then comes back and does change orders to
buying in? Yes, that can happen too, right? Yeah, I mean,
I
some
hear those
firm,
stories.
yeah, you hear those stories all the time, and I've seen it try to happen. And trying to justify that a low price is too low is difficult also for the government to do. So sometimes it does end up being you award to the low offer, and then they try to make up with change orders, or you just suffer through poor performance, and then that contractor gets a poor performance rating, and then that comes back over the next several years when they try to get another contract, right? So yeah, LPTA I think is has a purpose and a place, but it's not in the typical way government likes to think. They want to have the ability to trade off and think between price and technical superiority. And I think we're comfortable with that. Just as humans, we do that when we shop for a car, or we buy a house or whatever. I did a trade-off list when I bought my house. Okay. So I mean, it was kind of like we do this all the time. And I think that's just where we fall into. And I think that's part of the reason it's difficult.
Besides sole sourcing, we will definitely take trade-off, best value, negotiate any day versus LPTA, right?
Right.
So we wish that they would just remember that, and because we were looking at an opportunity today for a client, and
yeah,
like, dang, why are they putting this as LPTA from a ground up construction project, LPTA?
Yeah, that's odd to me. That's odd to me. Now, there are types of construction projects that are like, design, build, site adapt, all these things where you're given a set of specs and you're saying, okay, take the set of specs and adapt it to this site. Okay, that maybe you could do LPTA with that. That would be a stretch in my mind still. But yeah, I mean, it's just not really meant for construction, in my opinion. You're on mute, Randie. I'm sorry. Totally. There you are.
Sorry, I hit that by mistake. Totally agreed on that. So I know you mentioned, you can the contractor can get low CPARS again. They can have a bad report. So great time for us to talk about that. Don't forget, like you said, that you can discuss those CPARS and send in your comments. So why don't you share a little bit about that, what a contractor can do?
Yeah, contractors too often just accept a CPARS and let the comment period go by, right? They have 14 days to respond. Take advantage of it is what I'm going to say. There's two sides to every story. And, everybody understands that things happen on projects. It's never perfect. Anybody that tells you they've had a perfect project is kidding you. So, not understanding that the government looks at different elements under a CPARS. Also, there's management, there's, meeting your subcontracting goals, there's performance, actual performance, schedule, cost control, all those things. But understanding that, you have a story to tell too, and telling it during that comment period is important. Don't just let a CPARS roll out without at least acknowledging that if there were issues that you understood them and you mitigated them, or if you had concerns, sometimes it's personalities on a project. If, there's nothing wrong with stating that there were issues beyond your control. Maybe you had weather, maybe you had site changes, maybe you had another contractor you had to work with on the site that maybe was running behind while you were trying to stay ahead. There's all sorts of things like that can come into play. And CPARS it gives you a lot of room to talk and explain. And for contractors, I think you should take advantage of that and tell your story.
I agree. Thank you for sharing that. So that's one more thing, not to be afraid to let your voice be heard, respectfully, again, giving your own perspective on what happened. So there's a lot of compliance things that we've kind of touched on here and there, and would love to talk about it for the sake of our audience, right? For them to gain knowledge if they're not aware of it. And so let's talk a little bit about the Davis-Bacon and related acts changes that took place. And August of last year, and officially became, I guess, law or in the rules, October 23rd of last year for everyone to start following. So
yeah.
I was reviewing it. It's like 222 pages long.
It's very long.
So
Yeah, but
kind
there's
of like not sure how everybody is going to enact that.
well, these are the first major changes in a very, very long time,
It's like
right?
40
So,
years.
yeah, 40 years. So they're important changes to know. Really, it kind of boils down to three areas of change that I think are probably the most important for contractors to know. So the first is that they've updated the definition of what a prevailing wage is, and they've returned to what used to be called the three-step process for determining whether a wage rate is prevailing. And it goes into what that is. So basically, a wage rate is prevailing if it's a wage rate paid to a majority of the workers. And if you don't have a wage rate that's paid to a majority of workers, then it would be the wage rate paid to the greatest number of workers, provided it was at least paid to 30% of the workers. And that was a step that was eliminated back in, I want to say, the early 1980s, but it's been brought back by this rule. This 30% rule is now back. If there's not a wage that's been paid to at least 30% of the workers, then it's a weighted average rate. So that's how prevailing wages will be determined going forward. And then the rule also outlines just procedural processes for considering and implementing things like equivalent rates, collective bargaining agreements, wages that might cover multiple counties, things like that, right? So it gets into the procedural processes for how that occurs. And then the last thing that the rule does is clarifies the type of construction, meaning general categories of construction that are established for the purposes of general wage determinations. And there's 4 types used by DOL. It's building construction, residential construction, heavy construction, and highway construction. So those are the 4 that are in there. Now, the rule doesn't say that those are the only 4 that can be used to establish a general wage determination. It leaves it kind of open-ended, that there could be, maybe another category out there that DOL could use to establish a general wage determination, but those are the 4, and it clarifies that definition. So those are really the 3 major parts of the changes that I think are of interest, depending on how that fits what you're doing on a site.
So, I was in doing some research. There is some pushback on it. I don't know where they are on the pushback. It's like, it's kind of unfair and how they want it implemented and some of the requirements. And then you've got the Fair Labor Standards Act. So,
right.
Doesn't that, which is the FLSA, doesn't that seem to maybe is subordinate to the Davis-Bacon, since fair is more of the minimum wages and so forth? Well,
yeah, it's based on the salaries, right, that somebody earns in the course of a week or over a year. And the construction industry has a little bit of a different twist on FLSA. Construction is a service, but the Fair Labor Standards Act says that in the construction industry, a business must have 2 or more employees and have a annual gross sales volume of 500,000 or more to be subject to the Fair Labor Standards Act. So there, it depends on the size of the business. 500,000 is not a lot, right? So that keeps it pretty low. And like you said, it did increase the salary threshold up to $1,059 a week, which is quite a jump from where it was before. I think it was in the $600 range before. And what that does is that opens up a lot of people to the time and a half payment up for overtime and things like that. DOL actually has a fact sheet on the FLSA and how it fits in the construction industry, and it provides a lot of specifics. You can actually just go out there and search on FLSA construction industry, and it will pop up from the DOL website and Department of Labor. And so I would suggest looking at that. It's got a lot of great information there. It's quite involved, so it's a little hard to have a good discussion about it here. But
I started reading the fact sheet, and I'm like, Davis-Bacon, 222 pages, and a fact sheet. Like, okay.
Yeah. And the other great thing DOL has is they have a great wage and hour division, right? And they have people all over the country. They have local Department of Labor representatives that when you have questions like this, you can call and ask. So you keep yourself out of trouble, right? You don't do something and then just hope and keep your fingers crossed that you're okay. Talk to DOL and ask the questions and make sure you get it right. I've seen wage determination, audits from DOL, and companies can end up having to pay more money to their employees and fines when they are, in violation, found in violation. And it's companies that had no intention to be in violation.
Right.
They just happened to have a disgruntled employee, or they had a sub that wasn't happy. One phone call, that's all it takes, and it can cause an audit. So you want to really, make sure you've got it right out of the gate.
So when, like, for example, when you're working on a construction project and you get, you have your RFP, normally in there, they talk about, they actually provide you the Davis-Bacon determination wage rates, right?
Right.
For the most part. So how should companies approach that? Let's say they're newer, they're not even thinking about this, they don't know. Like, should they approach it at, hey, we're going to stick, I know the 50% rule for the majority, 30% if you don't, so should they approach it as, okay, we're going to look at, we have more electricians than we do plumbers, than we do, carpenters. So maybe we just say, okay, if the electrician is more than 50%, I'm thinking this is how it is, so please correct me. If they're supposed to be making $30 an hour, then everybody should be making at least $30 an hour. They should right?
Yeah. So actually how the wage determinations work is they're floors, and they're the minimum that labor category should be paid on that job. It doesn't matter if you have 1 or you have 100. That's the minimum amount they should be paid. A lot of people look at the wage determinations as a ceiling. It's not a maximum rate. So just understand it's a minimum, and that you can pay more. And, good for you if you are, right? So in terms of making sure, you're hitting wage rates, you have to do it for every covered employee on that wage determination. So there's no, it's when DOL determines a prevailing rate. That's how those go in, that 30% rule and stuff goes in the majority or the 30% or the average. That's what gets put into the wage rate. The wage rate, though, is what the contractors have to comply with.
Okay. So speaking of wage rate, right, kind of going, we can now shift a little bit to PLA.
Oh yeah. Project labor agreement.
Project labor agreements. The big elephant.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.
So that was the executive order that was handed down last fall, November or so, it was handed down.
Right.
And I know it was addressed in the State of the Union actually too. I was just at the ABC, which is the Associated Builders and Contractors conference.
Oh, great.
I was just there last week, and every time everybody heard we would do federal BD consulting, oh, well, let's talk about that PLA, right?
Yeah.
That was like the talk of the town. And I'm like, look,
yeah,
we're not. It's a hard one.
Well, I think it's change, right? And nobody likes change, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's the PLAs, the project labor agreements for construction projects, for federal construction projects, are really only going to be applicable where it's greater than or equal to $35 million for the estimated value of the construction project. So that's the requirement. But FAR and the rule and the EO left a nice little loophole there that says the agencies can, at their discretion, require a PLA at a value on a construction contract under 35 million. So you may see them under 35 million.
Well, that too.
Yeah. And I wouldn't be surprised if you did, right? Especially if there's some critical, high visible, needed construction contracts where they fear there could be some risk involved in completion, right? And it's really, the PLA is there just to make sure all the parties agree that they're going to resolve disputes over certain provisions in the PLA using a grievance or an arbitration process, that they're going to negotiate and agree between the parties. It's really just to make sure construction contracts get done efficiently and effectively, and there's no harm to the mission of the federal government in the process of making sure that happens. And protests and claims and disputes and all sorts of things can really jam up a construction project when they happen. I've had a couple that have been pretty messy over the years, and it can really cause a lot of performance issues unnecessarily if people don't understand going in how the best way is to resolve some of their disputes.
But doesn't it go beyond the conflict and making sure everybody is, we are amicable, we figure out how to deal with situations, but it's also how much they're getting paid, et cetera, et cetera.
Talks to unions and all that too, right? In those agreements. Yeah. So it gets down to all of that, making sure everybody's kind of on the same page from the get-go again, right? So I don't see them as a bad thing. I think when the government is investing 35 million or more in a construction project, I don't think this hurts. We used to do project kickoff meetings, partnership meetings, all sorts of things like that when we would kick off large projects like that when I was a contracting officer and chief of contracting. I just see this as a written, formalized process for that. It's done a lot, just not in the formality of a project labor agreement.
Okay. All right. Well, there's always something to keep learning about that. And so is there a way, because when it first happened, I was having a conversation, I was asking about it to one of the agencies, and they were saying that there is a way if they need to, because they're still working through details and so forth, that it can be waived. So do you know if that is the case, if there is a way they can be waived?
I haven't heard of a waiver process for it, but I'm assuming that, people being reasonable people would talk about it and say, is there really a need on this project or not? Is this something? And I would imagine if it's going to have a waiver component to it, it would be like at the head of the contracting activity level. It would not be at a contracting officer level to waive that requirement.
Okay. Well, we'll keep learning and growing with it, because I know one of the things that came up last week was there's only 13% union and 87% is non-union. So that was the conversation that came up last week. So we'll keep learning about it. So one of the good ones that that probably everybody can agree on is the bona fide place of business one. So we can talk about that. And I see let's introduce what that is in case the audience doesn't know what the bona fide place of business for 8A specifically. This is specifically for the set aside for 8A construction companies.
Right. It's for 8As whether they got their contract either sole source or competitive, right? So the bona fide place of business is really a requirement where a participant has to regularly maintain an office that employs at least one full-time individual within a certain geographic boundary, right? And that does not include construction trailers or other temp construction sites. You actually have to have one full-time individual that is in that geographic boundary. What happened is SBA, because coming out of COVID, the pandemic, all the concerns about businesses needing to really focus and be efficient on operating their businesses, SBA looked at that and said this is not going to work while we're in the middle of the pandemic and coming out of it. So they allowed a moratorium on the requirement to have a bona fide place of business in a geographic location for 8A program participants through September 30th of this year. And I would like to see that extended. I'm hoping it'll be extended. Some of the other moratoriums other agencies have had out there for other COVID relief type of things have been extended. And I'm hoping SBA will do this as we get closer to September.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think there's hope for that one to be extended?
I'm hoping, yeah. I think if sometimes when these things come into play, I think it's interesting. The government will do these things on a temporary basis, and they don't realize that it actually works out okay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll see this become something where, it just becomes a permanent thing. I'd like to see it. GSA schedules recently did a moratorium on their economic price adjustment thresholds, and they've extended that through December now. It's been over a year and a half, and they're talking about making it permanent. So I don't know why this couldn't also have a consideration component there. I know SBA has a different view of the world in terms of making sure we're proper 8A firms are actually the ones in the program and doing the work. So that may change, their view on it as to whether or not it'll continue. But as long as they feel that there's no issue there, I wouldn't be surprised if it got extended.
Well, I think all 8As, well, let me not speak for all 8As, but I know a lot of 8As really appreciate that bona fide, that office requirement going away.
Yeah.
It really did help, because with one of my clients, that was a deal when they had the temporary holds. It's like, oh my gosh, now we can go after, right, opportunities here whereas we couldn't before. So that opens up so many more opportunities for the 8A contractors.
Right. It allowed them to grow and expand in a time where they really needed to be able to do that coming out of the pandemic. I mean, everybody, we all had, different, impacts from the pandemic, and 8A construction contractors in particular had that issue. And how are they supposed to cite people at these locations just to chase the work, right? So it is important. It helps this program grow and these contractors grow in that program, so they can graduate and go on to greater things.
Well, we hope that come September 30th, we'll see. Like, we're just going to cancel. That's not even going to be a requirement anymore.
I'm hoping. I'm going to be watching. I'm going to watch this one intently because I think it's a good move. I don't think it's a bad move.
I think it will be a great move. I think some companies may have their, like, why it's not, and I have an idea about that. But overall, it's a great move.
Yeah, if all things being equal, as long as there's no concern about the 8A in question who would be going after contracts, if the contracting officer in the government doesn't have a problem with it, I have a hard time with wondering why SBA would. I mean, yes, they are a party to those 8A contracts. They accept those. Again, they want to make sure businesses are doing what they're supposed to be doing on their contracts. But if it works out well during this gap period, and they've had no issues, then I don't understand why it may not, get extended a little bit longer, if not put in place permanently.
Agreed. So the next thing we can probably going to be the last one we would touch on is the Buy American Act. So that's one you listed. So let's talk.
That's a big one. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very important one.
Yeah, it is. I mean, especially in the construction industry, right? So I don't know how many times when the Buy American Act first came out, literally people were like, I bought this box of nails outside the United States. It was shipped in. Can I use them? Can I not use them? Right? I mean, this is what we were talking about back then. This rule, the most recent change is to DOD's Buy American Act requirements, right? It's basically taking the FAR rule that became effective in October of 2022, and DOD is now updating its DFARS, or its Defense FAR supplement, related to those domestic content thresholds that were put into the FAR language. And those are going to increase over time. In 2024, calendar year 2024, which we're in, that domestic content threshold has gone up from 55 to 65%. And then in 5 more years, it will go up to 75%. And FAR has yet to actually nail down the evaluation price factor preference for this domestic product content in its FAR language in 25.105. So that's going to be part of a future rulemaking process. And once they put that list of critical components and all that critical items in FAR, then they will outline what what the enhanced evaluation price preference will be when there are items that are proposed using those critical items or critical components. So we've only got part of the rulemaking done on that, right? We've got this get ready, on your mark, get set part, right, with the domestic content threshold, and then the go will be the evaluation factor when businesses can then start to take advantage of that when they propose those items.
Can you talk a little bit about the price evaluation factors? What would that entail, or what does that entail for the contractor?
Well, we won't know for sure because they haven't written it out, but what it typically is the contractor will get a certain percentage of price factored, enhanced factor in. So basically, if they have a certain price, depends on how the government wants to work it, but likely it's going to say, okay, if your price is, let's say $100,000, but you have provided these enhanced critical items or items that are made up of critical components that meet this domestic content threshold, then we will give you a certain percentage off your price for terms of evaluation, not for the government paying you the price, but in terms of the evaluation, it could make your price lower in the evaluated price that is used to determine the awardee.
Okay, so there's a bit an incentive almost.
Yeah, it's like an incentive. Yeah. And again, we don't know how the government is going to, structure these price enhancements. Okay. But typically what it's going to be is it's going to be some benefit to the contractor for proposing those types of items. And when the government evaluates price, there's a difference between the price that gets paid and the evaluated price. But when the evaluation is done, they'll have a preference there.
Can you share a little bit about evaluation versus what you just said? There's two.
Oh, evaluated price versus price you pay. Yeah. So when there's these types of situations where price preferences can be employed, then the government has two ways they look at price. They look at the price that's actually proposed, and then they have these price preferences that may be allowed to be applied during the evaluation of the price. So when the government racks and stacks prices from low to high, based on the prices that are proposed, you can see them very clearly. But when the price preference is applied, some of those proposals may or may not have a price preference available to them, depending on the rules of how the price preference would be applied. So those dollar amounts could rack and stack in a different order, and the government will decide and outline in its proposal how they will evaluate price, how that will occur. It's nothing done behind closed doors. It'll be in the RFP itself, how that would work, or in the clauses that are part of that, and explain how that would happen, and then how the evaluated price would be used to determine the overall selection for the awardee.
Okay, so it's kind of part of that. It will be part of the matrix, the evaluation matrix that they always give us when we.
Yeah, it'll be on the price side of it. Yeah, when the government does its price part of it, they'll look at that separate.
You said something that a thought came to me, which is probably going to be important advice. When you have all the reps and certs pages and pages in our RFP, so do you think that's important for us to reread every single time, or is that everything the same thing that you've already said yes to in your SAM registration?
Well, I think it never hurts to relook at those because they get updated over time. And as you go in and update your SAM registration and you do your annual update, or even, most people do it more often than annually, right? Just to be clear, because everybody wants to make sure they're filled in and correct before they propose on a big job. Check the dates that are out there. Sam.Gov now, it didn't used to, but now it shows the dates out there right next to the clauses, the provision numbers, not clause numbers, provision numbers. And you can see if something's been updated since the last time you updated your certs and reps. And you can tell because the date of those provisions will change. If anything changes in them, that date will change. And so check and see if there's something that's within the last 6 months, last 2 months, whenever you've last updated your record, and open it up. Open that clause up and read it, and make sure that, that provision up, excuse me, I keep saying clause, but it's provision at that point. Open that provision up and read it, and make sure that you understand it, and make sure that the fill-ins that Sam.Gov will pop in there automatically for you based on all the other questions you've answered are correct when you read it. I worked with a company not long ago who said, well, I think we're a small business. And I said, well, let me check your SAM record. And I went out there and looked at 52219-1, and it popped up that they weren't.
Oh my God.
And they were surprised. And they were like, how did that happen? And I said,
Wow.
well, we need to look at your record and see where did you do this? Was it in your gross receipts? Was it in the NAICS you chose? Was it, how did that work out? And sure enough, they had gone in and updated their gross receipts recently. They had had their administrator do it, and they had put in what they'd made, and they were no longer a small business. They didn't realize that they had gone over the edge of the size standard. So, it's important to be aware of those key elements and watch and look for those dates and read them. For sure.
That is so important. And I know a lot of contractors take that for granted. It's like, well, I've already read it. I did my SAM registration and okay, I'm good. And I'm like, no, you really need to reread those reps and certs because you don't know what they've added in there.
Yeah, double check, because every time a FAR change comes out, if it impacts a provision, it's going to be in there in SAM. And, and it's not just FAR, it's DFARS too, because if you've signed up to be a prime, you've got DFARS provisions in there too. So I know it's boring reading. I know it's the type of thing that'll put you to bed at night. If you have insomnia, use your certs and reps to read. But it's important. And
for our audience, DFARS is, just in case it's new,
Defense FAR supplement. So it's the Department of Defense's supplement to the FAR, which has its own agency rules and requirements in there for the way they do procurement.
Exactly. And that's important. And you think this thing, then there's some kind of a variation to it, right? So we definitely need to be educated contractors. That's important. And that's whether you're small, medium, or large. Now, the larger companies, of course, they have people that they can afford, right, to have on their team.
Yeah. And small businesses don't, right? Small business owners are wearing all the hats, right? So that's why you have people like Randie. That's why you have people like me that you can call and ask these questions of. And your, contracting folks, if you have a contract, ask them too, right? So, but it's very important to be educated and read. It's constantly changing. It's important to watch when those changes come out, and you don't have to read everything that changes. Just see if anything applies to you, right? Not everything will apply to you. So it's and the stuff that applies to you will not change as often as you might think. FAR puts out maybe, I would say, 6 to 8 FAR acquisition circulars, federal acquisition circulars every year, which is when the final rules are published. And that's not too difficult to keep up at. And you can see summaries of all those rules at acquisition.gov.
Exactly. Acquisition.gov is your friend.
Yes.
It's like you Google for FAR, right?
It's bookmark it.
Absolutely. I've had to go there and okay, what is that? I know there's a FAR rule. Like, what is the wording?
I'm so happy for acquisition.gov exists, because we used to have paper FARs, and we would try to go through pages and pages of a paper book to find that stuff. It's so great to be able to search and find it now. It's amazing.
It's like Google for FAR.
It is. It's great.
It is. It really
you can type anything in there and it'll show you where it's at. You can read it. It's super easy. Super easy.
It pops up. So so acquisition.gov for our audience. So Shauna, thank you. It's been an hour. I want to be mindful of your time. Oh my goodness. Great conversation. The time is going really quickly, but I think we've packed in a lot. So things that they should consider, and these are all the hot topics right now for policy changes and compliance, things that you really need to maybe take some time to dive into. So we definitely recommend maybe go back and listen again to the recording, jot some more notes down, and probably go and educate yourself on those items. So is there anything, last words that you want to share with our audience before you head out?
I would just say, be persistent. be communicative, communicate with the people in the government, communicate amongst yourselves when you're doing work, and be prepared, which is reading the FAR, knowing your compliance, and understanding your agency and its mission. And I think between those things, you can have a very successful opportunities as prime and subcontractors.
Amen to that. So thank you, Ms. Shauna. I appreciate it. It's always
You're welcome.
It's always a joy spending a few minutes talking to you. So thank you again for your time.
You're welcome, Randie. It's been fun.